Is this all something that you dreamed? You're in rapid eye movement. You go to bed one night and you wake up in the morning and you go, gosh, I've got this memory of killing a man.
I wish it were a dream.
Did you use that word to try to talk when you were talking about this? The word dream?
Yes, I did.
What did you mean by that?
What I meant by that, well, I hoped that it was a dream. I did. I did hope that it was a dream. And the memories, they seemed so distant. They were so hard to tap into that they seemed kind of dreamlike. And also,
as you sit there right now, did you dream about this? You're using the word dream.
No, I never dreamt about killing this man.
What you just heard was an excerpt from Ryan Ferguson's trial, where Charles Erickson clearly states on direct that his memories were not a dream. In the early morning hours of November 1st, 2001, Columbia Daily Tribune sports editor Kent Heitholt was found beaten and strangled in the newspaper parking lot. The murder went unsolved for 2 years before Columbia, Missouri cops received an anonymous tip implicating what were at the time of the murder 2 high school students, Charles Erickson and Ryan Ferguson. Charles Erickson confessed and pled guilty to the crime on November 4th, 2004, and Ryan Ferguson was convicted by a jury trial in the fall of 2005. Ryan Ferguson spent nearly 10 years in prison before his lawyer Kathleen Zellner got him released due to a Brady violation and his conviction vacated. To speak with me about this case is friend to the show, Alexa, who has explored the Anand Syed case as well as the Jamie Snow case with me. Welcome, Alexa.
Hi, Roberta. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on and talking to me about this stuff. So, when you were in the wrongful conviction movement, what was your understanding of the Ryan Ferguson case?
Ryan Ferguson is like one of the most famous faces of the innocence movement. I don't think there's any media at all that's even critical of him or his case whatsoever. What I remember from the documentaries and the stuff I read was that Chuck Erickson didn't have a good memory at all, was very unreliable, troubled. The police fed him every detail of the murder and he really knew nothing. And that there's absolutely no evidence that Ryan Ferguson was there that night. And I think the only physical evidence they talk about, they always say, points to someone else.
Yeah, we'll explore all those points, but boy, do the transcripts tell a different story. Let's start off with Erickson being troubled and delusional, and they sort of present it as if he woke up one morning, and, this went unsolved for 2 years. So he woke up one morning, and he had a dream that he killed a man with his friend, his good friend since the 8th grade, Ryan Ferguson.
Yeah, because he saw a newspaper.
And he was so, I guess, OCD that he couldn't stop thinking he did it, but he was absolutely wrong. And this wrongness created 2 wrongful convictions.
Yeah.
Let's talk actually a little bit about the personality types. And it's an unusual case for many reasons. One, however, is the convicted. We usually don't see the convicted murderers who are, first of all, upper middle class to rich, right?
Yeah.
Charles Erickson's mother is a microbiologist. His father is a lawyer who works for an insurance company. Ryan Ferguson comes from a very wealthy family. He's given a Mercedes for his 16th birthday. He has an American Express card that he's always losing. He's kind of a very cocky, outgoing. Some people say he's a nice kid, but he has trouble taking responsibility. Charles Erickson also is much more of a quiet, shyer kind of kid, and he's the one who is troubled by his conscience. And that is very clear by what's in the transcripts.
Yeah, it seems like Ryan was much more spoiled than Chuck. Like, Chuck didn't have a car, he didn't have a cell phone, but they were really good friends. They lived like 2 minutes away from each other.
Yes.
And Ryan was always taking him to school. They were such good friends that Chuck left clothes in Ryan's car.
And right after the murder of Kent Heitholt, suddenly their friendship just sort of disbanded. And according to Ryan Ferguson, there was no cause, but according to Charles Erickson, the reason was that he didn't want to be around Ryan Ferguson after the murder. So,
yeah, it's very interesting that they were such good friends and then not. And Ryan's just like, oh, it's for no reason at all.
Right. All of a sudden, after being so close, his clothes are in my car, to
And then he
nothing.
denies it at trial. When he's on the stand, they're like, so you and Chuck were really good friends? And he said, no, we were acquaintances. We weren't very good friends at all.
And that contradicts pretty much everyone around them, too.
He got called out for it on the stand.
Yeah, it's Ryan Ferguson's performance on the stand. Even Kathleen Zellner admits that he was not coached correctly on the stand. You know, he comes off terribly. It reminded me a lot of Damien Eccles, who has given interviews and said Miss Kelly wasn't a good friend. It's very similar. Now Erickson is just an acquaintance.
And the jury's just heard from all these people who know what good of friends they are. They know that Chuck was even keeping clothes in the car. So when he gets on the stand, one of the first things he tries to say is that they weren't even that good of friends. I don't think that jury, I mean, how are you supposed to believe much of what he says after that?
Right. Why?
And he keeps getting caught in lies. That's not the only lie he gets caught in. It keeps happening.
Let's put a pin in it and go back to how this started, because 2 years go by. They're out of high school. Charles Erickson is taking college courses. He's doing pretty well. And all of a sudden, things start to slide down for him. He says because he's having flashback memories of this murder. And he confides in two friends. And his story never changes. The skeleton of his story is incredibly consistent. That night, it was Halloween night. He dressed up in 70s clothes. He went to a party. It was shut down by the cops. As he was leaving the party before he could get caught by the cops, he's walking out and he sees Ryan Ferguson in his Mercedes. And Ryan Ferguson says, hey, come get a lift for me. And he gets in. They go back to his house. He changes clothes. They go out drinking. They're underage. Ryan Ferguson's sister helps him get into the club.
And just a reminder to everyone that this also is Ryan's story. This matches perfectly. This is Chuck's story, but it's also exactly what Ryan testifies to as well. Every detail. Exactly.
And what a memory. That's what I was really blown away by reading the transcripts. What a memory Charles Erickson has up until the murder. And then all of a sudden his memory fails him a bit. But Ryan Ferguson agrees that he did all those things that night. They were drinking. The cover charge was $10. Charles Erickson counted on Ryan Ferguson to pay for his drinks. He had 2 drinks, and they decided to rob someone for more drink money. And right across from By George, the bar they were in, is the Tribune, where Kent Heitholt works. Oh, they go to the car. They change. Kent Heitholt logs off at 2:08. Ryan Ferguson is making a cell phone call at 2:09. So they see Kent Heitholt bending down to... Oh, can you talk about the tire tool and your impression of that, why that stuck out so much to you?
Yeah, and Chuck's story at trial, when they're asking him what exactly happened, I mean, he remembers so clearly. Like, he remembers going to the car, taking off his jacket, going to the trunk. Well, they were about to just go try to rob someone, and he thought maybe like pickpocket, whatever. Mm-hmm. But then they decided they should get a weapon. I can't remember which one of the two decided this, but then Ryan opens his trunk and he says he roots around in there and he grabs out this tire tool and hands it to Chuck, and they're about to walk off, but then Chuck noticed there's this little piece attached to it that you had to like unhook. Mm-hmm. So he does that, and then he hands it back to Ryan, who puts it back in the trunk, and then they walk off. And it just really stuck out to me a lot, because that's not a detail that the police fed you. That's not something you heard from someone else. That's a memory you're talking about.
Right. And there's also a memory, a detail of the murder where he talks about hitting Kent Heitholt. So Erickson goes behind Kent Heitholt and hits him on the head very hard. And he goes down and he talks about Kent Heitholt making a groan, and that groan making it very real to him that he has hurt someone very, very badly.
He said he couldn't remember exactly how many times he hit him. At first, he was thinking maybe he just hit him once, but it was the groan. He's like, it's the groan that he remembers so well that stood out in his mind. And once he heard the groan is when he finally stopped hitting him.
Right, and he said he leaned back against the wall and he watched Ferguson strangle Kent Heitholt, put his foot on his back and strangle him to death. And the injuries to Kent Heitholt's neck were in line with someone who had been hung from a very high height, like the gallows. Like, it was such a brutal injury to the cartilage of his neck.
Yeah,
so
he
it's
had
like
to pull
overkill.
super hard.
Overkill, yeah. And as they were running away, can you talk about the witnesses?
Chuck says that he yelled, "Someone's hurt, get help." And one of the cleaning ladies that was there, Shauna Ornt, she heard this. She, she couldn't identify them in court, but she knew that it was two young white males, late teens, early 20s. She did make a composite sketch that looks strikingly like
amazingly like Charles Erickson. Yeah, amazingly.
Yeah. But she was in court and she said she just didn't know if it was them or not. She couldn't be 100%. But she made the sketch. She saw them run. She heard someone yell help. So did someone named Jerry Trump. He wasn't able to even assist in the sketch. He said the light was in his eyes, but that he saw also two young, early 20s, late teens, white males running from the scene.
The story is very clear. And then when Kathleen Zellner gets involved, it gets very muddled and dreamlike, strangely. Sort of gets taken apart in pieces and confused. And that's pretty much the story the public is familiar with. So the other thing that's always talked about this case is that Erickson didn't know anything about the murder. He didn't even know about the belt that Ferguson strangled Kent Heitholt with his own belt. What do you make of that?
So in his original interrogation, the one that was taped where you can see excerpts and stuff of it in a lot of these documentaries, he did seem unsure and deny even knowing that it was a belt that strangled Kent Heitholt. However, he admits at trial and after that he just didn't want to admit it to them. It was self-preservation. I have some of
Can
his
you read some of that?
quotes, from the transcripts here, where they're asking him about, why did you say this during the interrogation? He says, "I couldn't step over the ledge is the best way to explain it. It was hard. After dealing with it by myself and not thinking about it for 2 years, and then I'm sitting down here and it's all rushing at me, like, my God, I killed this man. I got to take responsibility for this now. I've got to go to prison for the rest of my life. I've got to tell them what that man did. I've got to embarrass my family." And then in another one where he's like, "Why did you say you didn't remember? Why?" And he's like, "It was the cost of remembering. The more I remembered, the more I was going to embarrass my family, have to admit to myself that I had done this terrible thing to this guy that didn't deserve it, and also going to spend the rest of my life in prison."
Yeah, that's something that's not really discussed very often when people look at true crime cases, is ambivalence. Because for one, it's so rare that you have a suspect or a convicted murderer with a conscience. That's something I don't come across, maybe never.
Yeah, Chuck Erickson absolutely has a conscience. Ryan Ferguson does not,
right.
It seems.
And you can see when Ryan Ferguson gets picked up by the police, they say, "Your buddy says you did this murder together." And he goes, "Oh, he's crazy." And he's laughing in the back of the police car, and he's laughing. I don't know about how many people like me have cried when you got a traffic ticket. Such a horrible experience. But this guy's getting arrested for murder, and he's laughing and chuckling, and it's like he's just going to a ball game with these police officers.
Unfortunate for him that he was taking it so nonchalantly, because the things that he said to the investigators really came back to haunt him while he was on the stand.
Yeah, can you talk about that?
Well, they told him what Chuck's story was. He was like, "Chuck's a liar. I had $30 with me when I got home that night. I didn't borrow money from nobody. Don't know what you're talking about." And then on the stand, though, he tries to say that that night meant nothing to him. It was just any other Halloween. Nothing about it sticks out. He does agree with Chuck's parts of the story as far as how he picked him up, them going to the bar together, all of that. But how he would remember to take that he had $30 on him when he got home is bizarre. And when he's asked about it on the stand, he tries to deny even saying that to the police because he knows how ridiculous it sounds. He's like, I don't think I said that.
And then there's another great part with the newspaper on the stand.
Yes. Then there's the newspaper where once he was arrested, told what it was for. He said that he had known about the murder. He had read about it in the paper the day after. And on the stand, when asked about it, he was like, yeah, I'm sure I did. My parents got the newspaper. And they're like, oh, really? At your house? Your parents' house? They got the newspaper? He's like, yes. He's like, oh, because I have an affidavit right here from the Columbia Daily Tribune that says that in October, November of that year, you were not receiving the paper. And he's like, oh.
And the defense tried to say that in redirect, say that, well, there's a free paper that gets delivered. Right, which is very...
So it could have just been the free paper that got there that exact same day. And he just happened to read it, even though his sister testified she never in her whole life saw him read the newspaper or watch the news.
I just thought the jury must just hate this guy after I read Ryan Ferguson's testimony.
He comes across so badly, and Chuck comes across so well. For the things that I read from the transcript, there's 100 more where that came from. He's very clear that he did... mislead the police at first because he wasn't trying to really take full responsibility. He was nervous, but that after thinking about it some time and talking to his lawyer stuff, he wants to take responsibility. And that's why he pled guilty. This isn't a Jay Wilds deal. And like Adnan in that case, where he got no jail time. This man got 25 years.
Right. It's not like that he just fingered his friend. And it's also unlike some famous cases of people who falsely confess. Like in the Jean Bonnet case, John Mark Carr won in notoriety, and it was easily proven that he was nowhere near. Right. This wasn't some famous case. And we also forget, like in cases like Chris Watts, when he first confessed to killing his family, he said that his wife killed the kids. He caught his wife killing the kids, and then he killed his wife and got rid of all their bodies secretly and pretended, he didn't know where they were for days because, that's normal. And then later on, after he made a deal and was in prison, confessed that he killed them all.
Maybe we should get Kathleen Zellner on it so she could get him out. Because,
right. He might
mean, if he didn't get all the details of his confession correct, that must mean he's innocent.
Right. And he told different stories at different times. But Charles Erickson doesn't tell different stories at different times. He tells the same story.
He did. Eventually, once Kathleen Zellner started representing him after the notoriety came in the 48 hours and all of that, he did change his story. And he changed his story to, I did the murder. Ryan Ferguson was there. He just watched.
Right.
He stuck with that for like a year, and then he changed it now to he made everything up, and he was never there.
We'll get to the great Zellner recantations in a bit. But before that, I just want to talk about Erickson as victim of the police who intimidated him. You always see this clip of the police in Erickson's interrogation saying, I don't want to hear any more of that, getting sort of up in his face and saying, I don't want to hear any more of that.
Don't give me any more of that
nonsense.
Dream.
So on the stand, Erickson says, no, I wasn't intimidated by the police. They didn't scare me one bit. Did you see me flinch? Did you see me be frightened or stammer? No, I was just waiting for him to finish what he had to say, and I was going to continue on with what I had to say. No, the police did not intimidate me into confessing, nor did they put words into my mouth. He was very clear about that in his testimony. So Zellner has used that as reason for why that the police all fed it to him, even though it doesn't make sense in the whole timeline of events that this was all because of an anonymous tip. So before he ever dealt with the police, he was confessing to friends.
The anonymous tip is important because that's another night. That's from New Year's of 2003, right? Mm-hmm. Or 2004?
Yes.
New Year's 2004.
Yes.
And Ryan's story corroborates Chuck's all the way up to the part where he also admits.
What is the story?
Okay, yeah. So the story is that Chuck has moved away to college, and I believe so has Ryan, but they both end up back in the hometown at some New Year's Eve party. And that's the first time Chuck has seen Ryan since high school.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to confront him. He's been thinking about this. He wants to confront Ryan. And so he does. He asks Ryan to go outside and have a cigarette.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he confronts him and that Ryan admitted it and other people overheard. And one of those people who overheard called Crime Stoppers and said, I heard Ryan Ferguson and Chuck Erickson admit to the Kent Heitholt murder. And that's the first time that the police ever got Ryan Ferguson and Chuck Erickson's names in regards to this. It wasn't from Chuck Erickson first or anything. It was from someone else who heard them. They went and took Ryan Ferguson's fingerprints, but they didn't match anything that they had because the fingerprints actually are in the inside of the car and not from the murderer.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't Chuck Erickson going to the police or the police going to him and saying, tell us this. Like, somebody else overheard it first. And then two of Chuck's friends went to the police who he had told. And that's why Chuck was there that day. Not because he, went in voluntarily and was like ready to tell them everything. He was at school and they went and picked him up. He was not prepared for that. And I think that's why he was very hesitant to tell them a lot of the details.
Right. He didn't turn himself in. And also that you made a great point when we were talking about this, that the friends were all under the same impression that both of them had done the murder, listening to that argument on that New Year's Eve party.
Oh, and part of it too with not the anonymous tip, but the two friends who went to the police, both of them said they were terrified of Ryan Ferguson and that he was on steroids and was threatening to kill them.
Wow. And Ryan Ferguson makes a very interesting admission that this is
but he does deny that. He denies that happened.
Of course he does. And he makes an interesting admission on the stand where he said, well, I didn't want to be friends with Charles Erickson because I don't want to be around someone who talks about stuff like that. And Kevin Crane, who was the prosecutor, is now a judge, didn't miss a beat. And he said, oh, you didn't want to be around someone who accuses you of murder? He picks up right on that.
He clearly
language.
Lies about on the stand is when he said he's asked about the New Year's Eve party, and he says that it was just Chuck saying, he's like, Chuck was just implicating himself. Chuck never said he thought I did it. He never said anything about me. He just said he thought he did it. And that's why I never really thought about it or cared, blah, blah, blah. But if that was true, the person who called the Crime Stoppers would have never given them Ryan Ferguson's name. They would have said Chuck Erickson was saying that's what Ryan was like. Well, I didn't have anything to do with it. That's crazy.
Right.
They said they heard them both confess.
And the other thing that they point to is that the evidence contradicts Charles Erickson's story. Can you talk about that?
There was luminol done at the scene when the cops showed up, and it showed a trail of two bloody shoe prints, like two different treads. Mm-hmm. And
but it was raining
down
that night, right?
Yes, it was raining. The tracks led. They weren't able to track them that far, but then they had police dogs come and try to track, but it didn't go that far. But the route that the dogs went isn't the exact same route that Chuck originally said that they went after the murder. I mean, it's another thing that he finally, admits to at trial, exactly, the way that they went and all that. But the main things are these shoe prints they talk about that they say didn't match Chuck or Ryan. And the fact of the matter is they could see the heel of one of the shoes and tell that it was probably a Skechers. Mm-hmm. They couldn't even tell if the other shoe was boots or tennis shoes. They couldn't tell the size of any of these shoes. They could never compare them to anyone's shoes. So to say they don't match them is wrong. They can't match them to anyone.
And can you talk about the hairs? They say hairs of the real killer were found in the victim's hand.
There's fingerprints that I mentioned earlier because they did test Ryan's, just hoping. However, all of the fingerprints on the outside of the car were too smudged to be usable. And fingerprints from the inside of the car that were actually usable all belonged to either the victim or the victim's family, except for 6 prints they were unable to identify. And the location of those was on the rear view mirror and the inside back windows of the car. So usually they even say bloody. There's bloody fingerprints. There was no bloody fingerprints. There was no fingerprints on anything they believe the killers touched. and then the hairs. So when they got to the scene, Kent Heitholt was still a little bit alive. You know, there's still some life left in him, and they tried to save him. So there was paramedics, firemen, police. The people at the Tribune found him first, you know, and they also tried to save him. So there's lots of people around. It's raining. It got contaminated. The scene got contaminated. But when the medical examiner showed up and like puts tape around them, right? These brown paper bags. And then when the body's taken to the morgue, they open up the bags and they find there's 4 hairs in his right hand and 2 hairs in his left hand. And usually they, Ryan Ferguson and Kathleen Zellner, refer to these hairs as bloody hairs that belong to neither the victim nor Ryan Ferguson or Chuck Erickson. These hairs were not bloody, and all of these hairs belonged to the victim, Kent Heitholt. However, there was one limb hair found in the brown bag I was just talking about from his right hand, and that one limb hair does not match Kent Heitholt, Ryan Ferguson, or Chuck Erickson.
And what did the prosecutor say about that? So what is a limb hair? I know it sounds obvious.
So it would be from an arm or a leg.
Okay. And what did the prosecutor say about where that could have been from?
The prosecutor originally was like, it could come from anywhere. It could have come from any of the first responders. It could have come from any of the cops. It could have come from someone at the lab. It could have been on his sweater if he hadn't washed it. You know, it could be on there for a month from a diner or like a waitress. It could be from anything. And the hair expert that testified for the defense actually across said the same thing, that it could be from anyone, anywhere. It's impossible to know. And since people shed so many hairs so often all over, it'd be ridiculous to even try to start testing everyone who could have possibly come in contact with him to see if it was theirs.
And what's interesting is Charles Erickson knew that there was very little physical evidence supporting his story, and he still wanted to plead guilty.
Yeah, that's like a huge thing to me too, is that he knew. I read some stuff from his lawyer that was talking about this, that he fully knew that there was no physical evidence that put them there and that his statements could be put into question. Chuck Erickson had no interest in fighting it. He wanted to plead guilty. Yeah, I have a thing from his lawyer. This is a statement he made in court during one of Ryan's many appeals.
Can you read it?
He's talking about Chuck, and he says, fundamentally from day one, he wanted to plead guilty. I discussed with him the challenges that could be made to those statements. I not only read the transcripts, but watched the videos, talked to him about what they showed, and talked to him about the options that existed and how we would challenge those statements. He did not want to do that. So that's really big to me.
Right. He wanted to do his time, which is, again, a rarity. So Ryan Ferguson is in prison for a long time before he finds Kathleen Zellner. What approach does she take?
She decides to just get all the witnesses against him to change their stories.
Everybody changes their story. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people. And
yeah.
Even from Kathleen Zellner's own website, she writes, Zellner and her firm convinced the only 2 witnesses against Ferguson, Charles Erickson and Jerry Trummo, that's a typo, Trump, to admit that they had lied at trial. And I asked my audience...
I love that she just admits it like that.
I asked my audience what that means. How do you convince someone that they lied?
Well, she really did a great job.
She doesn't say she uncovered the truth that they had lied and got them to finally tell the truth.
Right, got them to tell the truth.
She convinced them. She convinced them somehow. She convinced them
to change their stories. Not she found out they had lied, got them to finally reveal the truth. She got them to change their stories.
So what is Jerry Trump's new story?
Well, I would like to say that also that in court, she constantly is touting, how she's gotten all these people to change their stories. And that's how Ryan got out. And that's what you'll see in all the documentaries. But that's not true. Every single person who changed their story was found to be not credible in court. Not one of those people's stories being changed. Not Erickson. They said his recantation was laughable. They said Trump's recantation is ridiculous, that maybe he never saw him in the first place, sure. Mm-hmm. But the jury heard all about how ridiculous he was during cross-examination by Ryan's defense attorney, and that even if he had said on the stand it wasn't them or whatever, it wouldn't matter because he'd still get found guilty. And then there was Shauna Ornt, the cleaning lady, who after watching all the 48 hours and stuff in like 2013 or I think, yes,
she's the Asia McClain of this story.
Right. She claims that even though in court she said she wasn't sure if it was Ryan and Chuck or not, mm-hmm. she is now claiming that she told the prosecutor multiple times she knew it wasn't him, it wasn't them, but he told her to get on the stand and say she wasn't sure.
Which
anyway.
Is very strange. It seems out of character because in the questioning of Charles Erickson, the prosecutor, Kevin Crane, says to him, if you're unsure now, we can stop all this. I don't want to convict someone that's not guilty. Tell me now. Sort of like it reminded me at a wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace type moment. And what did he say to that?
I think isn't that when he
yes.
said, I'm 100% sure Ryan Ferguson and I committed this crime?
Yes. He said, I'm 100% certain that I committed this crime with Ryan Ferguson. 100% sure. That's the dream killer, the confused guy who was in a blackout. Oh, yeah. How many drinks did he have that night?
Originally, he said he had some beer at the house party and then probably 2 drinks at the club.
Yeah, not in a blackout. If you don't understand ambivalence, reluctance to be punished for crimes, if you can't understand the complexities of human psychology, then this case will always look like a case of innocence to you. I think.
I agree totally.
On a surface level, unless you read the transcripts, and Ryan Ferguson is really protected by the fact that most people won't take the time to read the transcripts.
Yeah, he's very lucky that it was raining that night, that, the scene got so, muddled, and that they didn't really leave any physical evidence, because if they had, he never would have gotten out.
So there's an issue with a newspaper and Jerry Trump's wife. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that's what actually got him out of prison. All these people's stories that, she got to change, that did help him in the civil, not to get him out of prison. To get out of prison, they filed 6 separate times in appeals courts. 6 separate times his conviction was upheld. Every single time. And then finally she finds a court with this habeas thing and uses the exact same arguments that have already been adjudicated. But for some reason, this court listens and says that this interview that happened with Barbara Trump pre-trial, one of the detectives had, where he asked her if she sent her husband a newspaper. And she said she couldn't be sure if she did or not. She wasn't sure. And that's Jerry Trump's story as how he eventually was able to identify Ryan Ferguson and Chuck Erickson, was because he received a newspaper in jail from his wife. And as soon as he saw the pictures of them two on the front page after they'd been arrested, he knew that those were the 2 guys he had seen that night.
What was Jerry Trump in jail for?
He's a pedophile. He's a child molester.
And it's very interesting because the way Ryan Ferguson's PR promotes Jerry Trump as the most important witness and that his recantation is so important.
No, he was so shaky on the stand. He had to admit that he originally said he could not tell who they were and that the light was in his eyes. The newspaper story was dumb. I don't know why I wish they hadn't even put him on the stand, because Ryan would have still been convicted. Absolutely. And
right.
They wouldn't have this stupid, because it's not even like his wife says, I absolutely never sent him the newspaper. I mean, even if she did, like I said, it wouldn't make him less guilty, but I could at least see that maybe being a Brady violation if she was positive she didn't send the newspaper, but he says that she did. But all she said was she didn't know.
Right. Zellner's going from court to court to court, getting told no, no, time after time. Really reminded me of a story my dad used to tell about a guy who would ask every woman he saw out for a date. And when asked why he was doing that, he said, well, only one has to say yes. So, I mean, it seemed like she really took that approach. Only
Yeah,
one
that's
court has
exactly.
to say that there's been some sort of Brady violation, and she tried several different issues. And this was the one that one sympathetic court said yes to, and Ryan Ferguson got out. And what happened after he got out?
Well, first, after he got out, of course, said that he was going to spend his life now getting Chuck Erickson out. They had a couple press conferences all about that, but since
Where
that
is Chuck
time in
Erickson right now as we
2013
record this?
Right. He is sitting in prison still. They're doing nothing to try to get. She dropped him. She's not even
Who
his
dropped
attorney
him?
anymore. Zellner. He's got a new attorney.
I know.
I guess I can't be sure that he didn't fire her, but she's not his attorney anymore, and nobody's talking about Chuck Erickson at all, especially Ryan Ferguson.
Right. It reminded me once again of the West Memphis Three. You said we can fight this from the outside and find the real killer. And you have to know that Ryan Ferguson's dad made this his mission. He hired private investigators to look for other suspects.
Wait, after Ryan was out?
No, during, when Ryan Ferguson
I'm sure
made
since he got out, they don't care about it.
No.
Not looking.
Thank you for clarifying. No,
okay.
But made it his mission to get Ryan Ferguson out. There's never been another suspect that has made any sense. No other story.
Oh, no, but hey, they try to blame the coworker, even though there's a trail of bloody shoe prints from two people. There's multiple witnesses that saw two teenagers. One looks strikingly like Chuck Erickson, but they try to blame the coworker.
One guy.
Yeah, one guy who left in a car. They even admit left in a car from the siege.
I love Ryan Ferguson's Adnan-ish remark that it was a Halloween night like any other. First of all, if it's Halloween, it's not a night like any other. And, you would think you would remember a bit.
Oh, well, he does. He remembers that he was with Chuck the whole entire night.
Yeah. On the stand, he agrees with every part of Chuck Erickson's story except the murder. Strangely, at that time, he was home. He also tries to do a very Damien Eccles-like thing where he says that he was on the phone with a friend. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. He says this at trial, something about being, he's like, I know for sure, because they were asking him where he was at when he was making that 209. They were asking where he was at that. And he said that he was sitting on his curb outside his house. Really? Because we asked you a bunch of times during your interrogation the same question. And he was like, well, I just wasn't, I didn't know. I wasn't sure then. I didn't even think it was important.
Unbelievable.
There was, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but there was a jailhouse informant who said many things, including that Ferguson told him that.
Oh, this is interesting. Can you talk about that? Yeah, what was his name?
That's
the
why
jailhouse
I thought,
confession.
That's why I felt I was on the phone with my girlfriend thing at trial was interesting that he all of a sudden pulled this out of nowhere when I had already read this statement from Richard Walker. Mm-hmm. Here, let me bring it up. Okay, Richard Walker was an inmate in the same cell block as Ferguson. Oh, and also Erickson. On April 8th, 2004, Detective Strower interviewed Walker, and he indicated he had information regarding Ferguson's involvement in the Heitholt murder. He recorded that Walker relayed the following facts. After Ferguson made contact with Walker in the Boone County Jail, Ferguson told Walker on the night of the Heitholt murder, he and Erickson had left the bar up the street from the Tribune around 1:15 or 1:30. After driving away, they decided they were going to rob someone for money. They hit Heitholt with a tire tool. Afterwards, Ferguson took Erickson home. According to the report, Ferguson told Walker that he had told Erickson that Heitholt was not hurt that bad, and Ferguson did not think they had killed him. But Ferguson and Erickson stopped being friends because Erickson continued to ask too many questions about that evening. According to the report, Ferguson told Walker that he had been given a stress test and that he had beaten the test and was going to beat the murder charge because his girlfriend was going to testify she was on the phone with him and he was calling from his house on the night of the murder. And then it gets more interesting because, so they went back in September 2004 to talk to this guy. Mr. Walker says that Ferguson told him that if Walker would help him bring discredit to the prosecution regarding Ferguson's case, the Ferguson family would provide an attorney for Walker's daughter who had pending charges against her. According to Walker, The plan had been that Walker would make statements to the police regarding Ferguson's involvement in the murder and then later recant. However, after Ferguson refused to follow through on his end of the bargain, Walker decided to back out of their plan.
Wow.
And, it is a jailhouse informant that didn't testify. That's just a statement. But a lot of it rings true as far as his family saying he'd, hire a lawyer. I mean, that sounds very Bill Ferguson. And the girlfriend phone call thing.
Right. You always see Bill Ferguson, Ryan Ferguson's father, as the face of his PR, and they really sell it as like a father's love for his son unjustly convicted for murder, and he'll fight to the death to get him out. The love of a father, type thing. And his father's name, is connected. He's to the documentary. I mean, his father is really behind a lot of the PR that the public will become familiar with, is familiar with in this case.
Yeah, him and Zellner have been quite the team.
So what happened civilly in this case?
He ended up getting $10 million because the police, they admitted no wrongdoing at all. Mm-hmm. However, they were worried, according to an interview with one of the detectives, they were worried that because of, continuing anti-police sentiment and, just how Kathleen Zellner is, they just worry that maybe a jury wouldn't see them favorably just because, they're cops and Ryan Ferguson is such a big name. Mm-hmm. So they made a deal where they fully maintained they did nothing wrong, and no court has ever found that they did anything wrong, I will add, but they put in like a no contest type thing. So they agreed to give him however much money they had in a account that's set up for stuff like that. They had $250,000 or something in it, and said, if you sue for more, you have to get it from an insurance company. We'll agree to this now, but you can't take any money from us personally, and all you can have is this $250,000.
But
and I mean that I understand doing that as opposed to possibly having a jury, take everything you own as a cop, even though you feel you did nothing wrong.
And strangely, Kevin Crane, the prosecutor's name, was dropped from this suit.
Thank goodness, because he seems amazing. But they really hate on him a lot.
They sure do. I think they dislike him because it's one of the greatest tried cases by a prosecutor I've ever read in court transcripts. So
I do want to say that the $10 million, the reason he got that much is it's not like a judge heard all the evidence, and heard the police's side and was like, oh my gosh, the police are so wrong, that you get $10 million. The whole hearing where she decides $10 million was just Ryan Ferguson and his family and friends going and testifying about how horrific jail was for him, and that he spent almost 10 years in there, and it was just so bad, and he deserves all this compensation for it. It wasn't up to the judge to decide if he was wrongfully in prison or anything like that.
It's just not a mandate of his of his innocence.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But don't you
I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that.
What I find so peculiar is that everyone understands the concept. He got out on a technicality, which is exactly how I would describe Ryan Ferguson.
Yes, exactly.
But yet when someone gets out on a technicality, often the response is, well, they wouldn't let him out if he were guilty. This is a case like any other in that there's no non-side out there. There's no West Memphis 3 facts equivalent in this case for Ryan Ferguson. There's no real non-side.
I've never seen any critical media of him.
Not one. He's always written that he was wrongfully convicted, and in the documentary they go to his horrible time in prison. They love to play up that it's just the worst thing ever, that he was in prison and he suffered. They love to play that up. And a phone call with his father is very telling, where his father says something to the effect of, well, that's what they want you to do, son. They want you to be demoralized and, have a bad attitude and break down. As if it's Ryan Ferguson up against these terrible, monster, horrible, evil people who are so proud
right, who
that
just
they
hate him for no reason.
Hate him for no reason and can't admit they were wrong and
right.
need this conviction, which is absolutely, you'll never see the bit of the trial where Charles Erickson is told, are you sure we can stop all this right now? If you're unsure, I don't want to convict anyone who's not guilty, let's stop all this right now. And Erickson says, I'm 100% sure I committed it. You'll never see that in anything, because that's not a very exciting story. Dream killer, guy unsure, might have dreamt it, might not have. That's an exciting story. Great witness, guy who can't live with his conscience and comes clean and takes his punishment. Could be a good story, but it's not the story they went with.
It's not, but it is interesting when you see Chuck Erickson today and his most recent interviews with his, story now he's still going with, that he didn't do it, and he just made it all up at trial. But he's not really trying to get out that badly. I mean, in that one interview, he says, don't believe anything I say.
I think not that he is trying legally to get out, but I think what you mean, he's not making a desperate plea to the audience of his innocence.
Yeah.
Because
nobody's talking to him or about him anymore. Like, it's all about Ryan Ferguson, like maybe Chuck gets mentioned, but probably most people don't even know he's still in there. Nobody's going and doing 48 hours to talk to him. So when the very few people do show up to do interviews, you'd think that when he has the microphone put in his face, he would just want to say, like, I am innocent. I did make up that story. Like, I can't believe I'm still in here. But instead, he's like sitting there with his dog on his website.
What do you mean he's sitting there with his dog? What do you mean by that?
Oh, he's like a dog trainer in jail. And so he has his dog with him, like in one of the most recent interviews. And isn't that the one where he says, don't believe anything I say?
Yeah, he says, I don't expect the public. Look at the evidence. Well, unfortunately for you, Charles Erickson and Ryan Ferguson, we did look at the evidence. We did read the transcripts, and they're devastating to your case. They don't support your case. He's just counting on the fact that most people don't have the time to read the transcripts. But unfortunately for you, some of us do read the transcripts.
It's not like, why should we think you're innocent? It's not because I am innocent. Like nothing that it's, well, you shouldn't believe anything I say. Like,
who says that?
It's very shocking to me that to see someone just seem to not care that much.
I think that it's going to be devastating for him psychologically and life-wise. He's not comfortable with, he's not an accomplished liar, No,
he's
uncomfortable with it. Not very good at it at all. Do you have any other thoughts? Did we miss anything?
I would just encourage anyone who's skeptical about Chuck's story and or Ryan's innocence. I mean, I loved reading all the transcripts. I was fascinated by them. So I would encourage everyone to read them. But if anything, just read Chuck Erickson and Ryan Ferguson's testimonies. Ryan Ferguson gets caught in lie after lie after lie, and Chuck Erickson is very credible.
Yeah, once again, it's a real testament to the power of cross-examination, often called the engine of truth.
Yes.
You can tell a good story, but in cross-examination, it's very hard to keep that story up. The details get pulled apart and you get tripped up. Or Ryan Ferguson.
Yeah, it's so easy for people to change their stories for a documentary or write an affidavit or tell Kathleen Zellner or whatever, when it's been years later. But when somebody's on the stand being cross-examined under oath, there's a lot more veracity to that. There's this quote from the last judge that had denied the habeas petition for Ryan Ferguson before the next one finally granted it. And he wrote that he considered Erickson and Trump's testimony not credible, particularly Erickson's, in light of the various accounts of the murder he's now given. And Erickson's recantation is a textbook example of why the law views recantations with suspicion and caution.
So I would encourage my audience to look at recantations in the same way. And it reminded me a lot of Murder in the Park, that documentary where there was recantations and changes of stories. And you can see exactly why they happened. And
yeah, that's fascinating.
Kathleen Zellner takes credit for these. She says she's the reason these recantations happened. So...
and I believe her.
And I believe her too. So, Alexa, thank you so much for discussing this with me. I'd also like to thank Lisa O'Brien for providing me with the transcripts from the Clear and Convincing podcast. And I'd also like to thank my Patreon supporters for making this episode possible. Alexa, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
My name is Jack Stewart. I'm a canny gunman and a roving young fella I've been. So be easy and free when you're drinking with me. I'm a man you don't meet every day. I have acres of land, I have men at command, I have always a shilling to spare. So be easy and free when you're drinking with me. I'm a man you don't meet every day. So come fill up your glasses with brandy and wine, whatever it costs, I will pay. So be easy and free when you're drinking with me. I'm a man you don't meet every day. Oh, I took out my dog, and him I did shoot all down in the county Kildare. So be easy and free when you're drinking with me. I'm a man you don't meet every day. So come fill up your glasses of brandy and wine, whatever it costs, I will pay. So be easy and free when you're drinking with me. I'm a man you don't meet every day. So be easy and free when you're drinking